Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, January 22nd, and our friend Lasha Kasradze is back with us. Welcome back, Lasha.
Thank you very much for having me back, Nima.
Just to remember, do I pronounce your name correctly, Lasha?
Lasha, yes, that's
Yeah,
fine.
great. Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
And let's get started with what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, because then we can talk about the situation in Georgia, which is so
sure.
important for the situation in Georgia. Do you think with the new administration in Washington, the strategy is changing, or as Donald Trump mentioned just hours ago, that they're going to put more sanctions, they're going to force Russia into negotiations, which there is no reason for that because Russia is already talking about negotiation, and they don't need any sort of force to go after some sort of negotiation. They have been talking about negotiations for more than 2 years, 3 years in this conflict. How do you see the new administration in Washington?
Nima, that's an excellent point. It's been the subject of discussion now for quite some time for all of us. Um, I wish I were more optimistic. In the beginning, I mean, you look at these things and you see, a new administration coming in, someone like Donald Trump, who promises all these things, and yet you look at these things with a grain of salt. Um, but at the same time, you cannot help but to think and believe that, to a certain extent, that things, will change. Um, and yet, we are seeing some very, you know, concerning uh, developments. I mean, there are some patterns that are being some contours of his already first few hours, first 48 hours of his, administration of him becoming president, that may indicate that there will certainly be more doubt. Doubt will increase as to what Trump will actually do, or will he follow up or follow through with his promises when it comes to Russia-Ukraine war. Um, and again, unfortunately, those doubts have increased, at least in me, because this is look, this war has to end. Fine, of course it has to end. It was a enormous tragedy for Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe. Actually, Europe has suffered enormously because of this. Has been used as a pawn, really. Um, and we're looking at just basically one capricious foreign policy that emanates out of Washington, mostly, that dislikes anyone that disagrees with it. Georgia has experienced this, but since we're talking about Ukraine right now, um, and so anybody who says otherwise is considered to be either pro-Russian or they don't want freedom and democracy. Well, guess what? I think Trump will come under sway of the neocon, neoliberal establishment in Washington. To what extent? That's another question. Um, Everyone talks about Marco Rubio, including me. I've sort of tried to analyze Marco Rubio's role. Um, Look, Marco Rubio is a very clever guy. I mean, he's a professional. He's a smart man. He understands what it means to have and to live in an autocratic regime. Coming from his Cuban background, in many respects, I can personally relate. I mean, I come from Georgia. I know what the Soviet regime looked and was like. Um, uh, but when it comes to international relations, and when it comes to unnecessary wars, and when it comes to not being able to pick and choose, perhaps not the right phrase here, but to be able to delineate sort of vital national security interests, and figure out which strategic region matters most, and then formulate your foreign policy around that. And instead, what you do is you just, as a, on a blank slate, basically, you just go out there and you look at every culture, every country, every state, every region, geopolitical region as the same. Well, then guess what? If one of those one of those parts, gets replaced, that the entire region is being envisioned as wrong. So instead of separating out, national security interests and acting that way, I think that Washington has been making the mistake of basically looking at this entire war and equating, say, Ukraine as this great, a resisting force against the imperial Russia that is going to come in and dominate the entire European continent. We know that that's not true. We know that Russia is not capable of doing it. There has been no evidence of that. And yet we're seeing this push, just to go back to your original point, we are seeing this push now as fresh into the White House. Trump is sort of perhaps not him personally, he wants to do this, but then again, the system, sort of this neocon system, neoliberal system, the Washington establishment, a lot of people, we constantly talk about this neocon, neoliberal, but they just call it the Washington establishment of the foreign policy, Washington elite. And they just cannot bear the thought of president coming in and saying, look, I really genuinely do not want to go to war or escalate with Russia over Ukraine, because strategically this has nothing to do with us. There is no vital national security interest in Ukraine, and there is no vital national security interest in the South Caucasus. So, what are we doing? Can we shut this down? So, long answer to your question is that thesis, that position has been weakened, in my opinion. To what extent, I don't know. I still would like to think that, Marco Rubio or anyone else will follow the Constitution and serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. But politically speaking, some of the advantages that Trump has is that this is his last 4 years in the White House, right? I mean, he doesn't have to run again. And so will that give him some leeway, some freedom of maneuver to take care of this problem, and then this whole part comes. What does it mean, take care of this problem, right? What that includes, but sort of the final analysis is that yes, that those doubts have increased, and it's not as cut and dry as it might have seemed when Trump was campaigning against this.
If Donald Trump was to fight the establishment, he has to be well informed about what's going on, at least in the regions that he's talking about. We know that he's not that much interested in Ukraine, but he sees the bigger picture of the region. And here comes the importance of the administration around him, these people around him. Do you think the outcome of these people would benefit, would bring, let's put it this way, would bring Georgia in the same direction as we saw with Ukraine, or they're gonna go after a different, an alternative strategy?
Just to clarify, you mean they will up the ante with Georgia? They will increase the pressure. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that has been the fear in Tbilisi. Look, this is my personal opinion, but I think sitting back and hoping that Trump will save the day is exactly the wrong strategy to have. Trump might mean well. He might, on a personal level, this is not a warmonger. He would much rather, conduct some very transactional sort of economic, policies that benefit United States. Fine. Let's let the economists sort of worry about that, and with all the tariffs and trade wars and economic nationalism, if you will. But in terms of geopolitics, in terms of international relations, and sort of this traditional, liberal hegemonic approach to world politics, that's not Trump. And so then the question is, if Trump gets sucked into escalating the war with Ukraine against Russia, right? More sanctions, more provision of weapons to Ukraine. Will that translate also into Georgia and the South Caucasus? And I would say yes. I would say it would translate. I would, because if Trump does not calm the situation down between Moscow and Ukraine, um, then yes, it will translate it, and it will also, in terms of the Middle East, that will. I mean, Middle East sort of. I also look at it obviously and research it, but that will also be sort of more common, result in a more sort of overall energy to escalate in the Middle East as well. This fragile peace that we are talking about now between Netanyahu and Hamas and Gaza, that might also explode. So this could be sort of a collective process connected with each other, meaning that will result into returning into regional conflagrations. So one might think, what connections Ukraine has with the Middle East or the South Caucasus, and in my opinion, directly or indirectly, they're all connected. Georgia, there is certainly a fear in the South Caucasus of, say, for example, Iranian conflict exploding out of control. And what if Israel decides to bomb Iran as a result of sort of the backdoor politicking and influence, as we all know? Will Netanyahu sort of calm down and or will Netanyahu push and push and push with Trump, hoping that now with Trump he has another chance to make his wish come true, even though we see some conflict right behind the scenes between the two men. But to what extent that matters, or to what extent that conflict sort of will change the system's point of view in terms of Trump and the company, is to me is a very is a big question mark. But to go back to Ukraine and to go back to the South Caucasus, I think the dynamic is basically the same. The dynamic is that if Trump fails this, first of all, if he fails to bring this to an end, politically he will suffer. And as much attention as he had paid to finishing this conflict, his comments that he would end it in 24 hours, nobody ever bought that. But at the same time, politically speaking, he invested himself, at least during campaigning and sort of morally, ethically speaking, people expect him to lead the effort to finish this conflict. And if it fails, then he will politically suffer a great deal. And it will be one of the first negative signs of his administration. I think that, and then the question becomes, $1 million question is, what is he going to talk about? If Putin is not backing down from his red lines, what is there to talk about? If the 4 oblasts and the Donbass region is taken, obviously giving that back to me is out of the question, because there will be the capitulation of Russia, and that's existential to Russia, as the entire anti-NATO resistance, which resulted in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Those things are of vital national security importance to the Russian Federation. How will this play out? And does stopping the conflict mean yet another frozen conflict? So clearly there are plenty to talk about, and there's a very complex issue, and just a superficial approach, hoping that Trump, just because he's a negotiator or he thinks of it as some sort of a business deal, that's to me is just not serious argument.
I think the situation in Ukraine is important for Georgia, because if Donald Trump decides to go after more sanctions on Russia and put in some sort of pressure in order to Russians negotiate on the terms of the United States and to bring the conflict to an end, do you think that Georgia, how do you see right now the domestic policy in Georgia? Because if that goes in a wrong direction, they can bring the Georgia on again. We had color revolution, the situation with the president in Georgia, and after all, Georgia, in my opinion, is in the eyes of the United States is a new front for them to fight Russia. And how is that going to work out, in your opinion?
Well, the South Caucasus and the entire region there, from the all the way from the Baltic Barents Sea all the way down to the South Caucasus, has always been the region where they would sort of the Anglo-Saxon world thought that they would bring Russia down. But in terms of Georgian politics, regional politics, I mean, obviously I deal with it every day. I look at it every day, but Tbilisi is looking at this as a big shock and a question mark. Let me just give you a context here. The sanctions that were imposed, unprecedented and shocking. I never thought that I would live to see the day when Washington imposed sanctions on Georgia. But that tells you that this got nothing to do with love of Georgia or democracy or some nation building in the South Caucasus, in Georgia, or economic industrialization of Georgia. None of that ever mattered, let alone security guarantees and NATO membership of Georgia. So to go back to your point, it was just being viewed as a geopolitical space, a launchpad basically to weaken Russia. Well, none of that worked out for the benefit of the West. None of that. Russia has become more powerful, and this is one of the arguments. I'm just going to sort of broaden it up a little, if you don't mind. One of the things that I never understood was this whole logic of, Russia is occupied in Ukraine now, so it's going to be regionally, weaker. And people always miss the point where when Russia was down and out in the early 90s, so from early 90s to mid 90s, and then late 90s, where it was starting to sort of come back, it still managed to go into and conduct two brutal wars against Chechnya in Northern Caucasus and reincorporate that region into its sphere of influence and into its territory. And it did so when it was down and out. Russia in the 90s was suffering. We all know why, and we all know what happened. And yet it still managed to do it. And it also managed to exacerbate separatist conflicts in Georgia, right? So South Ossetia, the Samachablo region, and Abkhazia, Western Georgia, Black Sea region. So the idea that Russia is, and with the Nagorno-Karabakh war, by the way, when Baku, in my opinion, very strategically, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Iranians, Turkey. I mean, as you know, Georgia has this, no problems foreign policy. I think in that regard, I give them thumbs up because they have managed to, conduct a very shrewd regional policy towards our neighbors, and it's that's commendable. But South Caucasus would not be South Caucasus without all these regional conflicts, right? So if you take an example of, say, Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 war, when Baku reincorporated in its entirety the Nagorno-Karabakh region, people criticize Moscow. Oh, look, Russia just could not, balance anymore, and it could not, push its influence, and it sold out, Armenia, and because of weakness, because of Ukraine, because it doesn't have, stretched out on its resources. I believe there's nothing could be further from the truth. Russia has, in every single republic now, Russia has its troops. As a result of that, Russia's troops are on the Azerbaijani territory as a result of that conflict. First of all, and second of all, in terms of Russia's relevance and Russia's power and Russia's sort of reawakened notion of nationalism has kicked in as a result of this conflict, the special operation in Ukraine. And so the idea that now Russia's influence is less than it was before the conflict in Ukraine, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is a chimera, is yet another made-up story. So what am I saying here? I'm saying Russia, it has returned in the region. In relative terms, of course, it has to work with Turkey. Turkey has also returned into the region, not just with the whole Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan relationship that it has, but also with Syria, what it did in Syria. So yeah, Turkey has come back as a regional, sort of mid-tier power, but that has very little, if anything, to do with Russia's influence on the Black Sea, Russia's influence, especially in the South Caucasus or in Ukraine, and so Russia remains to be a major regional power. Sure, it has to again work with Turkey from the early 20th century, pacts and laws and what's the word? Not contracts, but it had agreements
Sure.
Turkey controls the Dardanelles Straits and the Bosporus, and Russia understands all that. But in terms of it's a nuclear superpower, first of all, and in the region it maintains its influence, its vital national security interests that South Caucasus and Ukraine comprise. And of course, with China as well, Russia has to be considerate in terms of China's influence in the region. But every one of these players understands the red lines and regional influences. China certainly does. China is not looking to take South Caucasus or use the South Caucasus against Russia. That's laughable, especially, at least in the long term. I mean, I don't see that happening at all. China wants to make money basically and use the connectivity projects that flow through the South Caucasus, through Georgia, and then the Mediterranean and Europe to use it to its own benefit in the Belt and Road Initiative. So the idea that Russia is somehow weak or it's preoccupied with Ukraine and therefore it won't be able to do anything if it came down to it. Russia has in Gyumri, for example, I think it was 3,000 troops stationed on the, in Armenian territory. Not to mention still troops in Ossetia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Within a single order, Russia could reinvade Georgia and take it. So, point being, the current government's in Georgia policies are so much more important because of what I just said. And because it's a suicide, it's political and state suicide, basically, to return back to those sort of freedom agenda and NATO expansionist policies, where Georgia was just being used as a battering ram against Russia. So to a large extent, I think fundamentally, the current government, with all its faults, I'm not a politician. I don't, I'll give my analysis to whoever, but with all its faults, it has grasped this sort of core issue that is Georgia's sort of regional foreign policy.
In a recent comprehensive agreement between Iran on January 17th, between Iran and Russia,
yes,
they were mentioning this region, all Central Asia, this part of between Iran and Russia. We know that Georgia has so many tradition and history with both countries, with Iran and Russia. Do you think that would influence the calculation on the part of these two countries toward Georgia? Because they were talking about no third party can influence their policies in this whole region that is between Iran and Russia. What does that mean, in your opinion, for Georgia?
Yes, that is actually shaping up as we speak. What's happening is, Nima, so just to give you sort of an umbrella view of it, the entire region is being molded according to sort of this Eurasian geopolitical principles. I keep saying this. So the ghost of Mackinder is overlooking this entire process. both in terms of geopolitics and in terms of geoeconomic projects. The port of Jabahar, if I'm pronouncing this right, I'm not sure, but out of southeastern Iran, India is acquired its management now. And that means that India will be going through the South Caucasus all the way up north and into Europe as well. So there are variety of geoeconomic routes that India is exploring. India's connection, by the way, with the South Caucasus goes back millennia. And so geopolitically speaking, the port of Jabahar is now being viewed by India as a strategic port that it will manage to gain access to the South Caucasus. Armenia benefits with this as well, into Western Europe eventually. So you see both geoeconomically and geopolitically the region being molded. This trip, in my opinion, was very important trip. Iran's president's visit to Moscow. It's a huge regional shift, and it's coming together. That doesn't mean that they're all friends. Doesn't mean historically there have always been problems between the two countries. But you see how pragmatism sort of overcomes historical disagreements and sort of shapes the region accordingly in terms of resisting, if you will, sort of this Western, liberal hegemonic approach to the entire region, which, by the way, is collapsing on its own self. I keep saying that. Philosophically, it is. It's not sustainable, in my opinion. But to your point, in Tbilisi, for example, my colleague, the rector of the Sukhumi State University, was one of the proponents of a 3+3 concept, which I think you alluded to, +2. So in Georgia, out of the Sukhumi State University, the rector and some other his colleagues and just scholars there are talking about this new concept that engages all three South Caucasus states with Russia, Turkey, and Iran, plus the two, meaning European Union and the United States. The idea being that the South Caucasus region will have to be looked at holistically as an entire geopolitical space from which not a single country can be used against Russia or against some respective superpower interests. And so geopolitically speaking and geoeconomically speaking, this concept sort of brings together, the region, ties it together, and sort of, puts it out there as a single geopolitical space where basically everyone is welcome, okay? Because the conflict as an instrument to reduce potential conflicts. And what we saw as a classic example of this is what we saw in 2008 with Georgia, what the United States was trying to do vis-a-vis Georgia against Russia. So in order to reduce these sort of politics of plucking out any single country, we are seeing some patterns of this now with France and Armenia. I think they try to repeat the entire scheme where they now are trying to inspire Armenia into turning its back away from Russia. This is laughable. This is laughable. Geopolitically speaking, Russia is etched with Moscow. Armenia is etched with Russia. It's a landlocked country. The only smart policy that its leaders can conduct is through these geoeconomic and geopolitical principles. So if you listen to France or the collective West, I believe they're gonna trap you into that Saakashvili trap, which is, we have Misha Saakashvili, this liberal reformer, and he's our guy against Russia. Well, if you repeat the same model, you're going to end up destroying Armenia all over again. So the idea here is to use these concepts to come up with something new. Russia is pushing 3+3. And here is another irony. When Washington sort of accuses Georgia now of being pro-Russian, actually academics in Georgia are pushing for the idea of 3+3 and United States and Europe. So in other words, to keep the region open to make money to enjoy geopolitical, geoeconomic projects, to have Europe and the United States invest in the region, and to sort of develop and entrench these sort of mutually beneficial interests. Now, I might sound too idealistic, but the idea that somehow Georgia is turning into Russia, or turning away from the West, or going into Russia, it's just simply not true. And so culturally, socio-psychologically, geopolitically, Georgia understands what that means. There will not be a single political career that will survive if Georgia decides in Georgia, if any Georgian government decides to actually become part of Russia. Okay, so this is just part of pragmatic politics, as a small country should be, or should be conducting in a very hostile region, and this is unacceptable to the West. And when they talk about with these sanctions that have been imposed, if you look at some language they use, that Georgia is turning against democracy, and this is ridiculous. This is absolutely laughable. This current government is incomparably more democratic. Incomparably, you cannot put the two governments together in the same room if you want to have a serious conversation. And yet, the previous government, which was autocratic, jailed half the population, was conducting under libertarianism, economic terror, confiscating private property from entrepreneurs and business people, not to mention egregious violations of human rights. The only criticism I heard back then was just some fleeting, paper here, paper there, an article here, article there. Saakashvili should just watch it. He should just calm down. This is unacceptable. And then it would just disappear. Those articles, those reactions, that would just would be marginalized. People would forget it, and the whole glorification of Saakashvili as the Washington's golden boy, great reformer, would kick back in. And yet, fundamentally speaking, the current government is much more democratic. Yes, there was some violence when they cracked down on the current opposition, which basically, by the way, they don't even know what they're doing. To be perfectly, they have no philosophy driving it other than sort of extreme ideology of this neoliberal, neoconservative ideology that drives them. Makes no sense what they're requesting. They're not requesting economic improvements. They're not requesting some sort of social improvements or for the welfare of the Georgian population. They're just saying, 2 + 2 is 25, and that's what we believe, basically, because this government is taking us away from Europe, or from and then into the arms of Russia. But again, United States is making a mistake. The thinkers in Washington are making another mistake, of which I am actually afraid, because you pose more sanctions on Georgia, and God forbid, if they increase and if they widen, the entire country will shut down. And I'm pretty sure that afterwards, you are actually, that's an excellent way to actually drive Georgia deeper into the arms of Russia. They will just, who is to tell that, look, Washington betrayed us, Brussels betrayed us, here we are under sanctions, and we need to make money. We cannot just starve, basically. And Russia is the largest economic partner of Georgia, and that will weaken Georgia even more. So politically speaking, there will drastically increase chances of Georgia, again, for the sake of self-survival, to get closer to Russia. So now, whereas they're just trying to be pragmatic and follow some basic geopolitical principles, in case of further imposition of sanctions on Georgia, what will happen is they will say, you know what, maybe we should just throw our hands up in the air and say, we give up. Take us, basically. And so economic, political, sort of relationship will be much faster and much deeper entrenched between Tbilisi and Moscow. And that's not what the Georgian population wants at all. If you look at the statistics, it hovers constantly, 75, 80%, if not more. The entire collective Georgian population wants the West. But they also understand that the business as usual is simply not sustainable. So this is the irony of what we're dealing with here.
You've mentioned Armenia together with Georgia. I think these countries are trying to find some sort of balance between the East and the West.
Mhm.
You remember 2014, if I'm not mistaken, it was Viktor Yanukovych, the president of
Yes,
Ukraine, before the coup
yes,
happening. And he was trying to do the same in those days, but they have faced a color revolution, the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, and what has happened to Ukraine, and we are witnessing right now. I think it's a good example for Georgia and Armenia right now, because they have, for the United States, as we know, as we have been witnessing for many years, it's a zero sum game and they want everything or nothing. This is not going to work with these countries. As you've mentioned, the largest economic partner of Georgia is Russia. How they're going to ignore Russia? How are they going to ignore the influence that Russia has in that region? Armenia is the same. I would argue in when you look at the bigger picture, even with Iran and Russia, they both are trying to find some sort of equilibrium, some sort of balance between the East and the West. But the problem, Lasha, is what the mindset in Washington. Are they gonna give up on their zero sum game? Are they gonna change their strategy? Here comes the big question, which is not in the hand of these people in Russia, Iran, Georgia, Armenia, all of these countries.
that's ex- that's exactly right, Nima. I mean, you're right on the money there. Look, on the one hand, we are seeing uh, sort of the potential return of power politics. You know, this boisterous talk of Canada becoming part of the United States and Greenland and taking Panama and all, right? So we're thinking, look, maybe this normative, values-based, international, institutional, liberal world order is over, right? Because nobody wants to be, because the faith in those lectures, right, evaporated in the rest of the world. Nobody wants to listen basically to what Washington says anymore, because Washington just simply cannot be trusted. And by the way, behind that neoliberal sort of normative rhetoric was always sort of a ruthless power chase, right? But be that as it may, you have this international liberal sort of world, a rules-based order supposedly coming to an end. It is. In relative terms, it will always be there, as my good colleague James Carden told me. I mean, that instinct would always be deeply etched in the American sort of political psyche. But for now, it is coming to a relative end. And then we are seeing what exactly? We are seeing sort of this replacement of that rules-based order by power politics, right? Supposedly. So Trump's administration and Trump's rhetoric sort of symbolized it. And yet now we are seeing possible signs of being chained really back within that ideology again, or being dragged back into that ideology again, where this arbitrary treatment of countries or interests, it will still be sort of a holistic view of who is our zero-sum game of who is our enemy, who is good, who is bad, and somewhere in there will be interest-based foreign policy. Of course, Trump hopefully will push for that, where they will focus only on national security interests, vital interests, right, and reduce significantly this adventurous instinct in Washington. But I don't know to what extent that can be delineated. I don't know to what extent Trump can manage it. With Iran and with Russia and with the South Caucasus and with Armenia, it is that instinct that is driving sort of this Mackinder view of regional politics, right? Where they have to survive. They understand that the West is coming to dominate that very region so that Russia will be weaker. But is it working? And it's not working, right? It's not working. Russia has become stronger. So with that, will Trump follow that basic instinct of finally realizing that there is nothing they can do to Russia? There is no way of plucking out the South Caucasus and making it a member of the, NATO. There is no putting the Humpty Dumpty back together in terms of Ukraine. Ukraine is finished as far as I'm concerned. There is no Eastern Ukraine is not going back to Ukraine. Now, if they don't agree with this, with the whole situation, then we're talking possibly Odessa. Crimea will never go back to Ukraine, right? So what does Ukraine have to show for it after, 3 years of this tragedy that was, in my opinion, imposed on Ukraine? Now people will hate me for how dare you, Russia went in there. Well, Russia was provoked. Remember that word, provoked? I don't see any other word to use. There was plenty of attempt to get to avoid this conflict. Immediately after, we know the Istanbul Communique, ignored. We know Minsk 1 and 2, ignored. It seems that only national security interests that matter are the national security interests of the collective West. Trump has. I think the reality, and I think the sort of the realist pushback in terms of power, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of history, and in terms of sheer will show the Trump administration that their options are limited. Russia is just not going to give up Ukraine. And if they come up with something better, great. If not, I think they will return back to, back to the square one, which is Russia will continue. I would not even exclude the possibility, if they fail, the negotiations fail, that Russia will move deeper into Western Ukraine, towards the West. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the transformation in world politics. We're dealing with the absolute unacceptance, shock, hatred of anyone who disagrees with the collective West, and yet at the same time facing that reality that was not to a large extent when history ended. We know Frank Fukuyama's thesis: when history ended, Cold War ended, Soviet Union collapsed, disappeared, and so the only concern was going to be boredom. I think that was the word that was used, right? And so they just cannot seem to come out of that dream. So I think that's the dynamic overall that we are dealing with here.
Thank you so much, Lasha, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Nima. Thank you. Thanks for having me again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.